Hello everybody, Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report, Wednesday's edition, broadcasting from beautiful Irvine, California today. Hey, we've got a little bit change in format today. We've got a very special guest with us today. I'd like to introduce David Harsanyi. David's the author of a book, Eurotrash, Why America Must Reject the Failed Ideas of a Dying Continent, and a lot of the implications are tied into what we're experiencing in the United States right now. David, welcome to Schaftlein Report. Happy to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So Dave, American exceptionalism, talk a little bit about why you wrote the book and why we're dealing with what we are, where current policies are really taking us in the wrong direction, and we do seem to be following the lead of Europe when it should be the other way around.
I wrote the book because I'd noticed that increasingly, there's always been, certain people, sophisticated elites, let's say, have always praised Europe as better than us on numerous fronts for many years. But I noticed in recent years that there's been an uptick in that sort of rhetoric and talk. I noticed that not only among pundits and academics, but also among politicians. So I thought I'd go through their most prevalent arguments and try to debunk them. And also, I guess it worked out for me in a sense, not for the country, but for me, that a lot of what the Democrats, frankly, are doing right now have parallels to European problems. For instance, the reconciliation bill, which is this huge expansion of the welfare state, probably the biggest since 1968, if they had their way. So I think these are good parallels to what's going on now. The problems at the border, for instance, talking about sort of a gigantic crush of migrants from the same place at the same time, and how that can be harmful for assimilation, things like that. So there are many parallels.
Well, we've noticed that, and it almost seems to me, again, from looking through your book, that the Biden administration could have basically taken your book and used it as a blueprint for what not to do, but they're following everything basically that's going on in Brussels right now. I mean, as you mentioned, we've got issues with the border. We've got issues with, again, rising cost, inflation. I mean, that's out of control right now. We're following policies. You talked about the $1.75 trillion bill. Thank God we have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. That thing could have been $3.5 trillion or higher had Bernie Sanders and the Democrats had their way. But the social spending piece, David, that's a blueprint for what's going on, as they say, across the pond.
Yeah, and it's not just the cost, which of course matters, and the debt, which of course matters, but also just the size of the bureaucracy that would be created to allow that sort of system to work. I mean, when you could talk about Denmark or Sweden all you like, but to scale a system from a few, maybe 9 or 5 million people to 350 million people means a massive bureaucracy, a massive centralized government. It's un-American, and I mean that in most genuine way. We have federalism for a reason. We have very localized communities, community outreach for a reason. We have local community and churches helping the poor, things like that. You have huge bureaucracies. They would elbow all of that out, and you would have this very wasteful, huge bureaucracy that undermines what American life is about. It would make us less. It would make us less vibrant, there would be less economic dynamism, there would be less everything that makes us different than a European country.
What do you think are some of the root causes of the way things are in Europe right now with the European Union? I mean, what's sort of the genesis on that? Because the continent does seem to have quite a few issues which seem to be ingrained within their society, and nothing ever seems to change over there.
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, because I think a lot of this has to do with policy, but the policy is just a manifestation of the culture, and I think that you have Americans who are generally and generationally risk takers. The people who come here, they take a risk. They always took a risk. When people settled out in areas where others didn't live, they took a risk. So it's embedded in American society in every quantifiable way, and I lay this out in the book. Americans are bigger risk takers. Like 80% or something of Americans want to be the boss. In Europe, that's a much lower number, around 20%. You just have a different cultural outlook. Another part of this is faith. There's a loss of faith, and that manifests in different ways as well. For Europeans, it means looking towards, for a long time now, looking towards either fascism or communism or now this giant bureaucracy to fill that void. So there are many reasons, I think, why those things are going on there. But at its heart, I just think it's a cultural difference between how an American views the world in his own life and how a European does. Of course, this is a generalization, but I just mean most people in Europe.
No, why do you think the Democratic Party is so hell-bent on following these policies? Because, we're in a situation right now where, contrary to Europe, we do have high growth right now. Of course, we got a Federal Reserve pumping $120 billion a month prior to this month into the economy. They're still doing 105 this month and 90 next. So it's not like, they're slowing down the money presses. But we've got the Biden administration advocating effectively higher taxes, open borders. I mean, we'll have to get into that a little bit later in the show. You see restrictions on free speech from big tech all the time. The Democrats lost major elections a couple weeks ago, but their desire to move this country left toward socialism is unabated. And then, you mentioned also in your book about the anti-Semitism that happens in Europe, and then this dedication to climate. All of those seem to be pillars of the Democratic Party.
Well, there's a lot in there. Yeah. I mean, I would say this, just to generalize. I think a lot of the people in the Democratic Party right now, progressives especially, but others as well, are turned off by the seeming messiness of American life, the way that our economy runs, the spontaneous order of things. They don't really like it. They're much more technocrats who believe they should want to control how people act in different ways because they see a lot of waste and a lot of consumerism and all these sort of buzzwords that they use. They don't like that as much. And European society is much more controlled. People in Europe are much more docile, frankly, when it comes to listening to the state. And that's a sort of country that they admire. So I think at the top level, they just want to compel people to act in certain ways. And the only way to do that is to have a stronger state. And that goes for speech. It bleeds into other things. I mean, they want to control speech because they don't like what people are saying. They call it fake news or misinformation or whatever. And sometimes it is, but that's the price we live with when we have a free society. We can't control what people say. And so these are the things that I think bother them. And when they look to Europe, they see a society that is far more regulated, has a far stronger state, has a far more pliant population. Again, not everyone, but most. And that's something that they admire and they want to see here. So I think at the heart of it, that's the reason. On a different subject, a lot of Americans right now, they're really viewing the president and the administration negatively. They see inflation running 6% or higher. They see their gas prices just escalating, and people in the Northeast are going to get hit with high heating oil bills this winter. It almost seems like the Biden administration was following a playbook out of Europe where they want to artificially increase the cost of fossil fuels so that they can meet their green energy goals from the environmental side of the Democratic Party. They've done that in Europe, and again, it seems like they're trying to follow that model over here. Well, I'm quite confused, quite frankly, when people, when Democrats complain about high gas prices, because that's exactly what almost all their policy prescriptions entail. They want to artificially spike energy prices, as you mentioned, to depress use, among people, and then that's what like carbon taxes are about. That's what cap and trade was about, in essence. That's what a lot of their policies are about. So I'm not sure why they complain, but they do. Now, I think to say that Joe Biden does these things on purpose is to give him far too much credit as a tactician or an intellectual or a Machiavellian character, because I just don't think he could pull it off.
I stand corrected on that one. I agree.
Yeah. But in essence, though, in the end, that's what he's doing, right? So I'm not blaming him for all the spike in gas prices. Some of it's just pent up demand. Part of it is it's a commodity that we don't have control over, but a lot of it is his fault. I mean, the first thing he did was shut down new drilling on public lands, to shut down a pipeline that would have brought about 800,000 gallons of every day, I think, or some huge number.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, those are things that he could do. Now, we could have a more vibrant domestic energy policy, and it would help alleviate some of those pressures, but he didn't do that. So he certainly deserves some of the blame, that's for sure.
Well, and as you and I both know, I mean, the price of oil goes into virtually everything. And that's what's part of the reason why you're seeing $85, $86 a barrel of oil. Again, it is a supply demand piece, but it's also the points that you mentioned. And now we have a situation where again, whether you love him or hate him, Trump's policies on energy had this country basically energy independent when he left office. And when you do the things that the president has now done, such as the drilling out the federal land, offshore drilling leases, ANWR in Alaska, shutting down pipelines, coupled with the increase in demand, boy, I mean, that really has people screaming. I mean, I guarantee they talked about election 2 weeks ago, education being the primary issue. It was also pocketbook issues, David. People are now, they're paying incrementally higher prices for everything. I mean, whether it's gasoline in their car, rents. I mean, the cost of shelter in this country is moving up much higher than the Bureau of Labor Statistics references it, because they're a little bit behind in how they calculate it. But companies, such as Zillow, such as Truly, other companies that measure this stuff on a daily basis, they're saying, hey, cost of shelter is running anywhere from 9 to 16% up. David, when you start having that happen, plus the cost of everything else, gasoline, food, the Democrats may continue to pursue these policies, but they're not going to maintain election majorities in Congress if these continue.
Right. I think you're right. I mean, inflation is, listen, a lot of our debates are ideological, let's say, or a lot of them are partisan, and people take sides. And when they elect a president, it's actually quite detached from the president's decisions over recent years, because they're much more inclined to think about issues, I think, when they vote locally, because it affects them more. But when you have inflation, that definitely affects them, and they feel it. They might not be able to pinpoint exactly how much more expensive things are, but they see it and they feel it. I think it is the most consequential political issue right now, inflation, even more than the education issue, because not everyone has kids, but even, in some school districts are fine, but inflation hits everyone. And I definitely think, and as you say, rising gas prices, that's embedded in everything, in the Amazon delivery, in the grocery delivery at your supermarket, it's just part of everything, which tells you, of course, that fossil fuels are the lifeblood of capitalism and the way you live your life, that if you're going to make it more expensive, there are trade-offs, and liberals pretend there are no trade-offs when it comes to green policies, which is because they lately ignore basic economics. I mean, it's like saying that the $1 trillion reconciliation bill costs zero. I mean, these are the same people, and they can't be trusted with simple economics. I'm worried that they're going to try to institute price controls on gas, and we're going to be like back in the 70s, where there's odd and even number days where you have to be online for gas. I mean, that's what's going to happen when you attack immutable laws of economics with stupid policies like rent control and price control. So yeah, I worry about all of that. And I think you're right about inflation. And I think they're going to take a real big beating if it continues.
Michael Bloomberg's financial advisor came out and said, hey, I told you so. He's high up in the Democratic Party. He warned the Biden administration of what was going to happen when you take all this spending that's happening. They did the $1.9 trillion bill earlier this year, David. That was the first thing he signed, coming out of the gate. Okay. The $1.2 trillion bill just signed, that's going to take years for that spending to kick in, but markets will anticipate that. But when you take all this money that's flooding in between the administration's spending and the Federal Reserve, how much the Fed is putting in every month, and then again, as you mentioned, you do everything you can to empower the sort of the greenies in the party, to benefit, quote, the country for helping on climate change, when private industry is already doing things way ahead of what the Paris Accords called for, you're going to really exasperate the problem. And I think that combination is where the Biden administration is taking the heat. I don't know if it's true or not, but I saw reports online that when Biden was talking to Xi, he was asking China to bring more oil onto the market. He's already been flagging with OPEC, asking them. It's almost embarrassing that a U.S. president has to get to that level when we had it under our own control less than 10 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, we would have been able to increase production and then lower prices worldwide even. If we had moved forward probably with all the plans. Now, there are other factors, of course, but you're right about that as well. And, the idea that even we don't exactly know how much this government spending is help, as part of the inflation, but every person with common sense understands that if you're going to throw trillions into the economy, it's not going to help with the inflationary pressures. We spent $6 trillion, before his administration, I think even came, maybe it wasn't six, whatever it was, a huge number.
It was four
at least.
Yeah.
So then on top of that, you have a lockdown, which now I think a lot of people, at least this is my opinion, was unnecessary. These pressures, this savings that people have, and people now want to spend, and all of the things that we're dealing with job losses and all of that initially were man-made, right? In the sense they were made by the state. They compelled people to shut their businesses down. So that's their fault too. Biden was in favor of all of those shutdowns. So then when he brags about creating jobs now, it makes me laugh. It's like this burning down a house and then bragging that you built a new house on top of it, right? So that is, I think, problematic as well. I think people understand that now. Does he deserve all the blame? No, but he also doesn't deserve all the credit he takes for every job created, right? So if you're going to take credit, you're going to have to take the blame too. That's how it works in modern politics.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. Let me ask you this. In the book, you talk a lot about migration, assimilation. In the United States, we've got a big issue down at our border. I mean, Mayorkas was up on Capitol Hill yesterday and today, Secretary Mayorkas. And I got to tell you, David, if I didn't know any better, and I'm not sure I do, it almost seems to me like the Biden administration, literally his job is to enforce an open border policy. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. We have close to 1.7 million people that have tried crossing that border. Some successfully, a good chunk of them successfully. And Mayorkas is basically saying, we don't really need to be enforcing the border until we fix our immigration policies. It's almost like they're saying, we can't get it through by law, so we're just going to allow people to come in. And again, Europe had some similar experiences with this, with people coming up from Africa and other places. And the assimilation didn't really go well in Europe, even as much as it does relatively well here in the U.S. Talk about that aspect, because that was a key piece of your book.
Well, I mean, listen, when you have anarchy at the border, as we do now, and that's what it is, and lawlessness, and when you have a government official saying, we need to fix the laws. Well, that's not your job, really. Actually, as a bureaucrat, your job is to enforce the laws that we have. Legislators can fix laws. You enforce laws. And the idea that they just don't, and they don't, is problematic. And they ignore the Supreme Court when it tells them to restate stay in Mexico, possibly things like that. I mean, this is just all lawlessness. So that's essentially what happened in Europe, where you had people streaming in from all over the place. And there's obviously these people, most of them, the vast majority, are looking for better lives, and that's great. But when you have people like you do when you have illegal immigrants here living in the shadows, as they say, which is true, they cannot participate in the civic life of the country. They will not learn the language of the country. They will not assimilate. Without assimilation, it's a big problem. We see that in Europe. There are huge populations in Europe that have not assimilated generationally. I mean, you're talking about people sometimes in Germany, for instance, who came in the 50s, and they still live in the same communities with high unemployment, high unemployment and poverty, and they're not assimilating, and that's problematic because it causes ethno-nationalistic backlashes. It gets pressure on your economy. There's all these other societal ills that happen from it, and that's what happened and has happening in Europe. Everyone loves, if you love to, tourists go to Paris and it's beautiful and they love it, but if they drive a half an hour out of Paris, they're going to see ghettos where people have lived, that there's high crime and high unemployment, and it's because they're very bad at assimilating people. We are actually quite good at that. We've done it for a very long time, but we're not going to succeed if we have anarchy. We have to have a system where we decide how many people come, where there are expectations of those people to embrace the liberal values. I mean, the real, lower L liberal values of the country, and come together and live here peacefully, which we have done with so many people. It's a miracle. Like, it's never happened anywhere on earth. In Europe, they can't even assimilate a single ethnic minority in any of these countries, really. But here we do it with many different kinds of minorities, and we live in peace. But that's going to be problematic if we continue to let people just stream over the border and not have any expectations of them. Like, first one obey the law, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Right, and again, the illegal immigrants that come aboard, they're treated better than certain Americans. I mean, Mayorkas was asked, well, why can't, you're requiring Americans to be vaccinated. What's the story with why illegal immigrants aren't required to be vaccinated? And he really stumbled through it. He gave no coherent answer on it. I mean, Ted Cruz basically lit him up by basically saying, we got 11 million people here that can't come in the country. We know that number of illegal immigrants is 11 million, and yet you've had 1.7 million come across this year. And, David, here's the sad thing about it down there. Besides the disease coming across, you've got the rampant crime. You've got drugs just flowing in through that border, through some of the people coming across. You have the trafficking that's going on. I mean, those issues alone should lead us to try to enforce our southern border, but it's not happening. And I remember the stories over in Europe where, you talked about the continent, but problems happen in London too, where you have these, I guess, ghettos of just people from one segment. They don't, intermingle with the rest of society in London. And now it's going to be happening here in the U.S.
Well, yeah, I mean, Europeans also have structural problems in how they bring in refugees. They have cities that they send them to and places that they send them to government housing that is removed, compartmentalized. It's not part of regular society, and that's a problem. And here I would say, listen, I think, of course, criminals are going to take advantage of anarchy. Yeah. And that happens. But even if we can see it, and I believe most people want to come here for good reasons, they will not be able to achieve any of the things that they will never be real Americans because they're here illegally. Maybe 30 years from now, you're going to say, hey, we need to give amnesty, this and that. But amnesty is a bad idea because it incentivizes other people to break the law. So there's a good solution to all of this. It's just called uphold the laws that exist. We have them. I agree that we need to change. I think we need to change our immigration system in certain ways, but you can't do that under pressure of a bunch of people just breaking the law. We can't have it. Americans aren't allowed to break the law, and we don't give amnesty to Americans for breaking the law. So I don't know why we should do that for others. And I think that the polls reflect all this, by the way. Yeah. I think it's actually underreported in a way. I think that most Americans feel like they have to tell pollsters, I love immigration, this and that. And I'm pro-immigration, but I think that when they see this kind of thing, they think, wow, the government has no control over this. And we're just creating this subclass. We're creating people who steal jobs, all those things. And it really there's a backlash. And I think that's one of the main reasons Donald Trump actually won the election in 2016.
Well, that's one of the issues that is first and on the forefront here in the United States. And that's going to play a big role in the 2022 midterms. I mean, you have a situation right now where it is completely out of control. We ran through some statistics earlier in the week. Biden's support for his border policy is hovering at 22%. And my question is, who makes up that 22% that supports having a wide open border? Well, the answer to that is the far left wing of the Democratic Party. But you're right. I mean, if this situation doesn't get under control, that's going to be another anvil around the Democrats next when it comes to 2022 elections. David, let me shift a little bit here because we've talked about the inflation, we've talked about the assimilation, we've talked about the issues with the border, but there seems to be a rising tide in some European countries towards embracing socialism, and they're trying to sort of, at least on the Democratic side of the ledger, export that here to the United States. How do you tie those two together, and is there any tie-in between what's happening there and what looks like the Democrats are trying to do here?
Well, there are obviously socialistic tendencies and socialistic policies in many European countries, but it's worth mentioning that, like Bernie Sanders, for instance, who is a socialist, right. That's what he says he is, right. That he, embraces places like Denmark, which are not as socialist as he says. Denmark is actually quite capitalistic in many ways. They have free trade, international trade. They have low regulations for many industries. They don't have I don't think they have a minimum wage. It's far less socialist than he says. They do have a giant welfare state that is propped up by that capitalism, and that's what he wants here. But they also, pay tons of taxes, meaning the middle class pays a lot of taxes, the lower classes pay taxes. Everyone pays in for that system. He just wants to tax rich people, which creates this terrible tax system where a few people pay for most things, that if anything goes wrong, the whole tax system collapses.
Right.
We have huge debt. So I'm just, they want to bring that system here, but they only want to bring certain parts of that system here. They want to bring the welfare system here. They don't want to bring the taxation system because they can't. Most Americans won't stand for it.
Right.
So that's worth pointing out. But yeah, I think that they, like I said before, I think that they're very, they admire the sort of control those governments have over people, over the economy mostly. And, I'm a free market person. I'm for economic freedom because I think most of our lives, not just how much money we make or whatever, is tied into the economy. It's how we get to live, where we get to live, what we get to do. There's a lot more movement in American economy, a lot more entrepreneurship, a lot of more risk taking, a lot more failure, which is a good thing, right? We learn from that as well than in Europe, where it's much more staid. And, I think that that's worth mentioning as well.
Well, you hit on a key piece there. In the United States, that's one thing that the socialists don't like. Hey, people fail. Businesses fail. Everybody doesn't get an A on their homework assignment. I mean, capitalism is tough at times, but it's got winners and it has losers. But at the end of the day, capitalism has made the United States the greatest economic engine in the history of the world. And now, we're sitting here, David, with, countries got a lot of debt, sure, $29 trillion plus in debt, but you're still generating an economy that's about a $19 trillion economy right now. And right now we're growing, last growth figures were north of 5%. So coming out of the pandemic, the United States is doing certain things well. And really, I view that in spite of some of these policies that we're having to fight against.
Yeah. Yeah, I think people underrate how much wealth we generate. They don't understand how much wealth we generate or how wealthy we are in general. If Britain was a state, it would be the second poorest state in the Union right now, after Mississippi, per capita income. Is there inequality? Yes, but people think that, and this, but they think that the world there's a zero-sum pie of money, that we divide up between us. No, we generate wealth. People are getting wealthier. We live in a way that is so far superior to Europeans in the sense of how big our houses is. I think they're like 1,000 square feet bigger on average than a European home. Now, a lot of people look down on that. They think that we're over consuming and we live a kind of lifestyle that is destroying the earth or whatever. That's fine, but don't pretend that Europeans are as wealthy as we are. They're not. All European countries would, except for Luxembourg and Monaco, I think, would be in the bottom third per capita in American wealth. So I think this is worth mentioning as well. So there's the tolerance issue, we're better at it. There's the wealth issue, we're better at it. I'm not saying we do everything better.
Right.
For instance, nuclear energy, like France does a better job than us of that, or, whatever issues you could come up with. There are a handful of issues, but in general, we live a wealthier and more tolerant and more open lifestyle with, top 30 tech companies. There's only one European company. Do people know that European Union and Europe itself has more people than the United States? They're wealthy. They should be just as competitive as we are. Yet Spotify is the only company, I think, in the top 30 that's European. I think it's Swedish or Finnish. I forget. Swedish.
Right. No, you're right about that. And of the top 50, I think 60% of them are U.S.-based companies?
Yeah. And by the way, when you look at the top tech company, I know people are mad at tech companies in general, but when you look, it just, but still they're at the, they're innovative, right? And the top companies you look at, and they're all like sons of immigrants or immigrants themselves. You come here to do that sort of thing. You don't, you come from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and from Western Europe, you come here because this is the place to be if you want to really try something out and take risks. Bankruptcy laws, like that's one thing Europeans are actually looking at the United States right now. You mentioned failure and capitalism. Mm-hmm. It's part of the mythology, basically, of every person who succeeded in this country. They accentuate that they had failed. From absolutely. Sam Colt to Edison, to anyone, they talk about it. In Europe, it's not the same way. Failure is very different. It can stop you from doing anything moving forward. So in the United States, it's almost a prerequisite for success. No one is successful their first time out, or very few people. So, right. So again, that goes back to the first thing I said about culture. I think that the cultural outlook on the world is just very different than the European.
One final thing, and then I want to get your sort of closing arguments here. The Europeans seem really just all in on this climate thing. I mean, the climate situation, it's almost like a religion to the people in Europe. The United States, not so much. I mean, we have investing through ESG, environmental, social. You've got the greenies, you've got the Democrats doing everything we've talked about on the energy side, but is the climate thing, is that also hurting Europe's growth rate because of the emphasis that they place on really, dealing with climate on maybe a more serious basis than the United States?
Of course, yeah. I mean, energy prices are very high. If you had to pay what Germans pay per gallon for gas, your head would explode in America. I mean, they do, like I mentioned, though, some of them do a good job with nuclear energy. If that's really, in my view, one of the only ways you can really bring down carbon emissions in any kind of serious way. But still, they don't meet any of the benchmarks they're supposed to when it comes to like the Paris Accords. We do just as well as them. It's mostly because of fracking, I think, and that sort of thing. But it definitely slows growth, but in a more insidious way. A lot of people there bought into the idea, Malthusian idea of not having kids because they are destroying the world and things like that. Right. And that's why, they talk about that and Germany, let's say, and then they have to replace those kids they're not having with more immigrants who they can't assimilate. So it's this problem that they're perpetuating. All of these trends, incidentally, are happening here too, just far slower. And that's why I wrote the book, because you have a lot of that kind of thinking here. I believe that climate change is happening to some extent. I'm not a scientist or anything, but I think that the policies that the Greens want to institute here would be much more harmful than the warming they're talking about, much more harmful. They talk about wealth like it's some kind of selfish, greedy thing that we do. First of all, I should quickly mention that we give 7 times as much per capita as a European does. But it's not just about that. It's about living our lives. And it's a moral thing, in my opinion, that we get to live these kind of wealthy lives and we help others. And we help our poor, if they were a nation unto themselves, would be somewhere in the middle of European, European per capita print. So that's what it's about as well. Anyway.
I concur with you, David, on that. You're spot on that analysis there. And again, you go to Europe, folks. I mean, look, David, shock treatment here. I filled up my car 2 days ago, paid $5.15 a gallon here in Southern California. So, folks, these higher gas prices, they're coming across the country. It's not going to stop as demand keeps going up. I don't mean to warn you, but we are going to see higher prices. David, we got about a minute left. How would you, if you were advising the Biden administration, and I know you're not, but if you were and you had Biden's here, what would you tell him? I mean, they just got trounced in these elections. A lot of things, his approval rating's 38 to 40%. What would you advise him to do?
I would say this. I would say that I think the perception of you when you were elected, though you said very different things, was that you were some sort of moderate force that was going to bring together the country after years of division, et cetera, and that you're not governing that way. You're governing from the far left. These policies that you want to pass are far to the left of Barack Obama, and the American people clearly don't like it. So what you need to do is to govern from the middle, start over, try to go to the Republicans. I'm sure there's some places you did the infrastructure bill, unfortunately, but whatever, but there are other things that you can agree on, and that's what you should do. And your perception of you will again change back to someone who's a moderating force in American life. But frankly, I think that he's past his prime, if he ever had one, a long way, and that he's very susceptible to those around him, and that he's not going to do that. But that's what I would tell him to do if I was there. And obviously, that's not what people around him are telling him.
Well, David, you know what? If I could echo what you just said, I would totally agree with you. And I would add one thing to it. Do whatever you can do to get increased oil production in this country, open up this great American energy source. And if he can do that, I know he won't because that violates what the greenies want. We might have a shot with inflation because right now the Fed has been wrong. That inflation does not look like it's transitory to me. And if they don't get their arms around the inflation piece, these 2022 midterms, there'll be a rout of 50, 60, 70 seat switch in the House of Representatives. Hey, David, listen, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. And this is a great book, folks. Eurotrash, Why America Must Reject the Ideas of a Dying Continent. David, thank you again for joining us. A wealth of information today. It's much appreciated.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you for the good questions.
Yes, you're more than welcome. Okay, folks, that's it for today. More insightful, good news for you. Great guests like David. We'll be back tomorrow. See you on Thursday. Stay safe and have a good evening.